Great. So we'll start the first Parks and Recreation Advisory Board meeting of 2024 for January. Welcome everybody, glad you're here. We have a one item agenda basically, but it's some really good content, so I think we're all looking forward to it. I'll call the meeting to order and we can take a look at the agenda and then we'll look at the meeting minutes for that we sent out for the last meeting. And I think the agenda is basically just to talk about the park design with the consultants. We have a bunch of materials, we can go through that. Any thoughts or comments, or would you like to approve that agenda? Okay. Second. All in favor of approving the agenda?
Aye.
Looks like everyone. Sounds like everyone. Some combination of those two. Great. That's the agenda for the night. And then for the meeting minutes for the last meeting we had was November. Those were in the message that Corey sent out earlier. Has anybody had a chance to review or approve, comment on those or any suggestions? Should we move to approve or any thoughts? Move to approve. Okay. Yeah, that's a second.
Sure.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's all right. I gotta get the words. Okay. Drop my chair. Great. So all in favor of those meeting minutes as written?
Aye.
That's everyone. Thank you very much. Okay, now that's the formal part. On to the first and only agenda item. Take it over.
Great, okay. So we have, can everyone online hear me okay?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Wonderful, thank you. To those watching online, would it be helpful if I had my camera on while speaking, or would you prefer to see the room?
I don't personally have a preference. Jeff, do you?
I do not. Either way is fine.
Yeah, either way is fine.
Okay, we'll keep it as is, but,
Can I ask real quick,
Yes.
who's online? Is it just?
Jeff Perigo, Public Works Director, and council member, or deputy mayor.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's all we have right now. But I'll let you guys know if Eric comes back in.
Thank you.
great. Okay, so the materials we sent out digital before the meeting started, and so everyone online, you have those. Everyone in the room, there's a printed copy starting with an agenda. So we thought we would take just a couple of quick minutes to do introductions. Then we've got some. We want to go through what is the purpose of this meeting? What are the objectives that we're hoping to accomplish? Then a quick review of the schedule. So today's date in relation to our critical keystone funding application deadline date, what happens between now and then. And then we'll get into the presentation of the meat of these concepts. We've got a lot of pieces of paper, some activities to do, and then a panel of expertise that we can pose questions to. So, okay, great. Start with introductions. Does the city staff want to start?
Yeah, Corey Roach, City Lake Forest Park. I'm the environmental sustainability specialist, but do parks board stuff. So.
All right, my name is Alice Peterson. I am a member on the Parks Recreation Advisory Board. I don't know what is relevant, useful information about me. I'm a parent. I am on the PTA locally. I'm a professor at UW Bothell, and I spend a lot of time in the north end of the lake.
I'm Josh Rosenau. I'm also a Parks Board member, parent, and PTA, and I work at the Mountain Lion Foundation doing conservation work, and so I don't think we're gonna have any of those covered on the park, but we'll see how good it is. But I'm interested in other animals that likely.
I'm Tyler Dittman. I'm on the Parks and Rec Advisory Board chair. And
Yeah, Richie, Parks and Recreation Board member too, and resident and neighbor to the park. that's being developed. Yeah.
I'm Amy Hannigan, I'm a Parks Board member.
Nice to meet you. I'm Amber McCusick. I'm the project manager and a landscape architect for DCG Watershed.
And I'm Kenny Booth. I'm a senior planner at DCG Watershed. So I'm kind of looking at things with regulatory side, trying to make sure whatever gets built can fit into all the overlapping regulations.
Chuck McDowell, landscape architect, DCG Watershed.
I'm Jeff P. with Transportation Solutions, where the traffic is.
Oh, that's a very important, that's.
That's why he's
Went over
here.
there.
I'm Jack Chapin with Johnston Architects. I'm a partner there and I am in charge of the building stuff.
Nice.
Great.
Jeff? Wanna introduce?
Hi, Jeffrey Perigo, Public Works Director for the City of Lake Forest Park.
And I'm Lori Bodie. I'm a council member liaison to the Parks Board and newly selected deputy mayor for the city of Lake Forest Park.
Take out those chairs too.
I think. If you want. Do you want us to scoot down so more people are visible on camera or just?
You guys will have more room.
Yes. Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and share our presentation. Okay. Wonderful. So thanks everyone for joining us here today. So where we are in the project is that we have done a lot of work. We've gone through multiple layers of the pre-design process, and we're here to present our conceptual alternatives. I'll talk to you specifically about the strategy that we've taken to do that, and then go through some of the information that we have pulled together to assist in the decision-making about selecting a preferred alternative for the park. So today's purpose of the meeting is really, to educate you Parks Board members about everything that has come before today, informing these.
Oh, Eric.
Do we want to give Eric a chance to introduce himself or not?
Eric, you wanna introduce yourself real quick?
Okay, great. So the purpose of the meeting is to review everything that we've presented, that we've put together today for the presentation, to provide you guys with information. So we know that one of the key responsibilities of the Parks and Recreation Board is to be advocates for parks development and recreational opportunities within the city. And so you are the first people to see this information. We wanted to give you a chance to review it in depth. So there's probably a lot of information in this package that you can pour over if you want to. You can take it with you, look through it, follow up with questions. But this is the opportunity to engage with us outside of the community meeting, which, as you've seen from the last community meeting, gets pretty busy. There's a lot of people asking questions. And so between today's date and that time, we wanted to give you a chance to look at this information, ask us questions. And we know that we will be out having questions with the community, and then we'll be all present at the community meeting. If you guys are there as well, you will have had time to look through the information, and if questions come up, you'll be able to speak from a more informed perspective than just showing up to that community meeting. So that's number one. Number two is that we did want to make sure that whatever we're presenting to the community needs to run through you guys first. So you are the appointed individuals who are looking after parks and recreation for the city of Lake Forest Park. And so for that, you have more knowledge, more institutional knowledge about the community's priorities and values than we do as a consultant team. We do our best to, when the project starts, to get immersed in the community and immersed in, the plans and the long range planning documents and those types of things. We go through the information. We're very well informed about the site itself and about the nuances of developing a project like this. But in terms of speaking as the community representatives, we really look to you. And so what we've pulled together is an exhaustive program of feasible alternates that respond to the layers of information that we've received along the way. So what we've heard from council, what we've heard from the community members, what we've heard from you, what's possible at the park, and what's within the scope and bounds of the program and conversations we've had to date. Now, it's possible that we may propose something that in your eyes needs to be revised slightly or needs to be pulled out of the program before we present to the community on the 21st of February. And so this is that opportunity to present this to you, and then for you to say, you know what you have here, you're on the right track, but we think that this item maybe either needs to be revised or omitted. And then we basically spend the next 3 weeks pulling all of that together based on the information that you gave us to present to the community on February 21st. So the last thing is that you are advisors to City Council as well. And so we do anticipate, as part of this process, the Parks Recreation Advisory Board making a recommendation for what the preferred alternative could be or should be, or what your choice would be as a board, and making that recommendation to City Council. So again, the way that we have the structured input to council through this project is to engage in a detailed conversation with the Parks and Rec Board. We bring things to the community, and then we bring to the City Council what we heard from the community, what the community's recommendation will be based on the data points that we have collected, what the Parks Board comments were, and how that informed our presentation to the community. And then if you guys make a recommendation as well, we're hoping that that will then provide the information that council needs to deliberate and then make a decision on what the preferred alternative should be. So we don't expect you to make a preferred decision today. So we'll go through the schedule, but we're hoping to provide you with some information that'll get us to that point. Okay, so in terms of schedule review, today is our Parks and Rec Board meeting. On February 8th, Corey is going to be making an update to council. Corey will provide you with whatever information you need, but we won't be present for that update. February 21st, we have been promoted, that's the confirmed date for the next community workshop. We will be presenting in a similar open house format that we did to the last time around, but with updated materials and exercises. So you guys also have a Parks and Rec Board meeting in February, the 27th. So that's another chance if you want to deliberate on this, to discuss it. We are welcome to, we can join that meeting if you think it would be helpful. If you need to discuss in a closed session with us not there, that's also okay. Just let us know. Again, the goal is providing you with the information that you need to be discussing this in depth and making a recommendation. So March 14th, the consultant team is planning to be at the City Council working session. So we'll be spending a 45-minute conversation, hopefully, with the City Council. Again, answering questions that they need. That would be representing essentially the first touch with the 3-touch rule for council. There is also another opportunity to engage with the council at the March 25th date for the committee of the whole, if they would like us there. March 26th, there is another Parks and Rec Board meeting. That would be the date when we would ask that you make a recommendation, hopefully, to the council if possible. And then March 28th would be our target date for the City Council to essentially approve. We are assuming that this will be done through approval of resolution, selecting a preferred concept. So what our target to have the preferred concept confirmed, so selected, the consultant team knows what it is, and we can begin producing our basically refined materials that describe the preferred concept, would be March 31st. So March 31st.
And this is Lori. Could I just make a comment? We have canceled our March 14th City Council meeting because the mayor, and I and the vice chair of the council will all be in Washington, D.C. For lobbying weeks, National League of Cities Lobbying Week. So that is a recent development, just a decision made this week. So just giving you that information so we can just make whatever minor adjustment we need to.
Wonderful. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bodie. I appreciate that update. We'll get an updated schedule. We'll note that in the change log. We'll update the schedule and we'll get that out ASAP.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is the schedule review in these materials?
It is. So there is
Can you tell us what page we're, where we're?
Oh, you know what? Actually, it is not. It is in the, it's not in the printed. Yeah. It's in the digital materials that you have that are a copy of the PowerPoint, but not in these.
I can send an updated schedule.
Well, as long as if it's in the PowerPoint, I was looking through here.
Right.
Where's this?
My apologies.
No, it's fine. I just didn't know.
So our goal for having that preferred concept is March 31st. That allows us April 1 to update all the materials, get updated costs, get updated sketches, updated plans, to put together the package of information that describes the preferred concept in detail. And that's necessary to provide Corey and the city with the information that they need to submit those applications to RCO for funding. So we need to know how much funding we're asking for. We need to know what specifically the funding is for. And we need to have that information soon enough that we can sit down and have a meeting with the grant advisors at RCO so that they can provide us with feedback on what are the best programs to target for funding for this project. So that March 31st deadline really is necessary for us to have a couple weeks to update this information, costs being a big one, and then to get that information to our RCO contact about mid-April so that we can still make the May 1 deadline. So June then will be our presentation of the schematic design package. That will include our proposal for fees for continuing the work into the next phase of design. We'll talk a little bit about some of that now. So our approach to our concept alternatives. So again, what we've done is take the multi-layered input that we've received along the way. So this includes things like site assessments. It includes our public engagement, our multi-layered, robust public engagement, and then the conversations with both direct stakeholders and then stakeholder bodies here. And what we have come up with is a strategy of concept options. So sometimes it's appropriate to essentially say, this is plan A and this is plan B. We can take these two options, these two directions. And oftentimes that's necessary when we have sort of a split opinion on things. We may have people who say sport courts are what the community needs. And so then we need to have a sport court plan versus a, private preserve type, situation. So we've got two things that can't necessarily exist on the site given whatever site constraints and conditions. And so we have to put together those separate alternatives and they live as separate things. That's not what occurred here. What we largely have is areas of the park where the community and everyone is excited and interested in a similar program, and we just need to refine that vision. And so what we have is the park basically divided into areas, and we have options for each of those areas. There is we've got two types. So site plan options, things that you actually see represented differently in the sketches, and then design options. So the design options would be things where, for example, we may have, if we were proposing a pedestrian bridge, we may have a bridge in an arch configuration versus like a truss configuration. So it's still a bridge. So programmatically, it's a bridge. Concept level pricing, it would be a bridge. But the design decision that we would make in the next stage would start to pick the placemaking and the architecture of the thing. And so all of those decisions about placemaking and architecture, all of those things, we've started to gather pieces of information that will inform that, but we're not there yet. We're at concept. And so rather than distracting the public with those details, we need to make some course adjust decisions about where we're going to refine this program. And then the next stage, preferred and schematic design, that's when we'll be dialing into those a little bit more. Okay, this park has many, many encumbrances. There's lots of regulations at play, even in a park where we wouldn't have some of the critical area complexities that this site has. So I am going to turn it over to Kenny for an update on that.
Yeah, thanks, Amber. So I'm just going to kind of give the high level perspective, what we're keeping in mind as this design has progressed, because like Amber said, there's a lot at play. Kind of three top things. Number one is that this is a park going into a residential zone. So there are a few regulations that pertain to that, and essentially making sure that we're compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. Right? We don't want to design a park that's disruptive to the folks right next door. So that's number one. Number two, we have critical areas on site. We've got, of course, the stream, a couple wetlands, and then third, we have a number of shoreline regulations that come into play from Lake Washington. Sort of combining those two together, critical areas, shoreline regulations, what we get is basically an overarching sort of mandate that requires the impact of this park to be the minimum necessary. And this is where it gets a little tricky from a design perspective, right? Because you can always maybe go a little smaller right here or there. So we kind of have, a project purpose, what's the program we're trying to fulfill? And then we are trying to kind of massage and be able to demonstrate to the city as a regulator in this case, that what the alternative is in fact a minimum necessary to fulfill that project purpose. And of course, the project purpose, is public access, and the list goes on and on. So it's a very subjective, sort of rationale that needs to be made, but that's sort of the bar that we have to cross when it comes to working within these overlapping critical areas, combined with the shoreline regulations. So another couple things I'll mention, the dock, which is a big part of the park. The city's shoreline regulations do not speak well to public dock facilities. So the shoreline regulations, the way they're written, essentially envision an all residential shoreline throughout the city. So we're a little bit handcuffed with the current regulations, as it pertains to be able to put in what would be more of a public size dock structure, longer, wider than you would see on your single family residential parcel. So with that said, the city does technically have the ability to make revisions to their shoreline code if they chose. The timing potentially could work out such that a change was made for this park came in for formal permitting.
Would that have to happen by May 1st?
It
Or
would
is that
not,
just by the
no.
time we start construction?
It would need to happen by the time any formal permits were submitted for the park. So May, I think, is the word grants.
The RCO wouldn't need
Yeah,
to see that.
no, it would not, wouldn't be complicated by that at all. So, so that's definitely a consideration. I think that's sort of obviously a higher level consideration with a lot of stakeholders involved to make a decision like that. But there could be much more flexibility when it comes to the size, configuration of the dock. If those regulations were sort of better adjusted to fit this public setting. And then the last thing I'll mention, everything I've talked about so far is kind of City of Lake Forest Park specific. The dock, the beach, anything over the stream, we will need to deal with state and federal agencies as well. They sort of have similar mandates when it comes to sort of minimum necessary, but not quite as strict. A little more flexibility, as long as you can kind of prove it's the minimum necessary. And then there'll also be a tribal component to our work, which is we don't need permits from any tribes, but we certainly like to keep them involved. They're essentially a commenting body, so they'll be likely to comment on any park design, as they have certain things that they'll be looking for, which are similar minimum size. They would like as much restoration on site to occur as possible, things like that. So that's kind of the 30,000 foot view of what we're kind of considering as all this design progresses.
So, relates to permitting, we will be talking, individually about these. There is if you look in your packet, the second page, there is a regulatory overview. We'll be touching on some of those issues. This is a lot of information. It does have a permit summary that represents the sort of risk analysis and the permitting hurdles for each of the options that we're going to be discussing. So we won't go in depth to that document because we don't have enough time, but it is in your packet, and feel free to look into it. We can, if you have any specific questions about permitting as we're just discussing the options, we can definitely spend a little time on that. So in terms of some decision-making for the park, there's often the question of, well, how do we avoid dealing with the core? Now, sometimes there is a program where you can say, if we don't touch this area or we stay out of this, then we don't have to go to those upper levels of permitting. We can stay local with the permitting approvals. Now, in this case, based on the structure assessments of the dock on the Turner property, the new acquisition, is condemned. It needs to be taken down. It is not safe. There are pilings that are half missing. If you look on the virtual tour on the website and you scan to see the view of the dock, you can actually see where some of them, you can just see like air directly through them.
Not how it's supposed to be.
Exactly.
That was a new design.
And so even to get into the water, to remove the condemned dock, do no other work on the shoreline and just open the park as it is, we would be in state and federal permit. And so there really is not an option to do this park and open it to the public without those layers. So we can assume that, knowing that, we just assumed we're in that zone anyway. Let's not have that be a constraint on options that we'll present and prepare for this meeting. Okay, so we've got the site plan and design areas. So this is planning level design. There is lots of opportunity for cost management. We do have a detailed cost breakdown of these concepts. So we're talking, you know, a pencil sketch, gross approximations of certain things. If you get into the detailed cost estimate, you will see things broken down by unit cost per square foot. You'll see things down to the penny. And then you have to back out. And the important information about that is that it tells us what are the key drivers of cost with each of these options. And so, for example, when we talk about something like the dock, if we draw a sketch and they price that sketch, there's, you know, the number of pilings, the number of this, the number of that, but the thing that really drives the cost is the square footage area. And so what we're showing in some of these is like a 10-foot wide dock. If we take that and we make it 9 feet wide, we have shaved off 10% of the cost. And so it really gives us the ability to say, okay, we can we can go to a different pier type. We can go to a different decking type. It barely moves the needle. The biggest driver is that. And so this information this early in the game helps us to move this forward in design and have cost management as being a key driver in the way that we move these designs forward. So these are conservative costs. You know, we're just so you know, when you see them in there, don't think that that's what it necessarily will cost, but this is important information for us to make it to the next step. Okay, so how do we price public projects? I have been to lots of public meetings where someone says, I built my dock for 20 grand over the course of a weekend. That might be true. It's a different type of construction. It's a different process. I don't know if they got permits. They may not have. And so when we talk about public place construction like this, a good way to look at it is relative to what else is around us. So when we started this project, the council pointed out the recent constructed projects in Kenmore, Log Boom, and Twala Beach Park as being, you know, these are great assets for the community in our area. These are wonderful inspiration examples of what we would like to achieve in terms of the outcome of this project. And so we have kind of put those as brackets in terms of the where our costs might come in as well. So obviously we have differences in area, differences in program. The amount of mitigation was a big driver in cost Twala Beach Park. I mean, there's a huge amount of restoration, land forming, earth moving that they did that really drove that cost. Then there's things like, you know, structures, bathroom, utility, all of those types of things that are different. But what we tried to do is provide a breakdown of some recent projects. Those are all escalated to $2026, which is when we assume that this project will go out to pricing. So today's dollars is one thing. When we put it out to a contractor to bid it, it will be future year. And so a lot of that math, if you go into your cost packet, the one with the yellow tab, this is page 7 for anybody who's joining online. You will see on the left-hand side some owner costs, soft costs. Those are costs that we would assume above construction. And on the right-hand side, you'll see here the escalation to Q2 2026 is basically today's pricing escalated at 9%. So we're assuming a 10% growth on that price. There's also things like a 20% contingency in here. There's assumed contractor profit. So what we're providing is a burdened construction price. So what you would pay to build it, and then what you would pay the contractor to build it for you is the number that we're showing. And that would be consistent with what the other park costs have been. So the item that's not shown in there are the owner costs. So that would be like what you're paying your design consultants, et cetera. So you'll see in that packet that represents basically a 40% markup on the left-hand side. And so when we ask for things like, how much do we ask for RCO? We would ask for the cost that the city would have to pay. The city would pay consultants. We would pay for like the geotechnical, you know, borings. We would pay for the utility hookup fees. We would pay permit fees. All of those sorts of things would be part of the financial obligation that City of Lake Forest Park would have to build this project. So that's where we need to focus on for those funding applications. Yes.
The page in the PDF is page 40.
Oh, 44?
Page 40.
40, okay, got it. It is numbered page 7 in the cost packet, and it is page 40 in the PDF. Thank you, John. Okay,
And in the, I skimmed through the packet
Mhm.
before, and I don't remember this, but maybe it's there. Is there, some of these are, one part of it, you kind of have to do things together. Are there other, does it talk about what costs might be deferred? As like,
Sure,
we
so
can't
phasing,
necessarily, we're not gonna do this
yes.
now, but we'll get to
Mhm.
it later.
yeah, so phasing the project is definitely a tool that we can use to mitigate costs, to divide cost over time. Now, there's smart ways to phase, and then there's ways that will actually increase the cost over time, but it'll allow you to do it in a couple affordable chunks. So phasing is a really great thing that we will explore when we get to preferred design, in terms of how can these things work together and what could we do to basically build the park in a cost-effective way. And then, like, the structure improvements may be one. We could lock the structure and open it in year 3. You know, so is that something that makes sense? Now, could we do something like finish the park and then build the dock in year 5? If we did that, it would mean closing the park while that work is happening. It would mean tearing up a bunch of the work that we already did, or we would have to come in by barge, which is a big increase. And so there's definitely phasing paths that we would look at and say, yeah, you could do it, right?
Permitting.
Yes, yeah, and so there's those types of things as well. So that is something that we definitely will look at when we're moving into preferred design, is how we can phase those things.
And some of that phasing could also be just decisions that get postponed
Yes.
about.
Or funding that we receive.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we receive, 70% of the funding, what's the best, most efficient way that we can get as much of the work done, and then continue to put in funding applications that are smart and savvy for the next 30%.
How many acres is logging?
That is a good question.
Anybody know? Seems big.
Kind of a funky
It
shape.
is.
Yeah,
It's kind of,
Yeah.
kind of,
I'm gonna keep going. Chuck, do you mind looking up for this? Okay.
This is us.
But if that wasn't like a full overhaul of it was pretty, yeah.
3.9 acres, but I don't know if that's the total that was renovated, but the total is 3.9 acres.
Okay, so site overview. So this is our site overview map. So you can, a couple of key features to point out here. A lot of those dashed lines are representing critical area buffers. So this is where different regulations apply. So we have the shoreline, we have several buffers and structure setbacks and things set up with the creek on the south end. So all of the structures are represented on here, and then we have a large area of paving that is the current parking lot to the preserve. And then there's the 2 dock structures. So again, as you can see here, there's very little area of the park that is unencumbered. And what this tells us is that we will need to, in addition to saying what's possible here, we'll need to figure out how those things can be mitigated for. We are expecting mitigation to be a core part of this project. Now, where are the best opportunities for mitigation? We need to be mitigating within the feature that we're impacting. So if we're in the shoreline zone, the mitigation should be in the shoreline. If we're in the stream area, the mitigation should be around the stream. And so naturally, around the stream and around the shoreline, because that is where most of our encumbrances are, those are going to be our best opportunities for mitigation and where mitigation will go the farthest. Yes, sure.
I'm sorry, I may be very naive here, but I don't understand what you mean by mitigation.
Oh,
Can you
sure,
bring it
absolutely.
down a little?
Yes,
For
definitely.
those of us who are sort of unfamiliar with, I know mitigation in another concept, but not like what you're talking.
Sure, when it comes to development in areas that are considered regulated, and so this would
Right.
be like a wetland, there's additional protections where it affects and limits and constrains development within a wetland. So does that mean that we can't develop, say, within a wetland buffer? It does. What it means is that the regulation, the code says, if you are developing in and around a wetland in its buffer, then you need to make a case for what else you are doing that's a restorative action that'll mitigate for the development impact that you're making.
Okay.
So for example, we have our, right now, we've got a dock that is actually in a wetland along the shoreline. If we wanted to reconstruct that dock, they would tell us to apply mitigation sequencing, which means at first we would avoid affecting the wetland in the first place. Then if we needed to, if it was unavoidable, they would want us to minimize the impacts that we had. And then the last choice is that, okay, so you don't have a choice except to put it right here. So what are you going to do to mitigate for those? So keeping the dock in its current location, when we actually have shoreline that doesn't have wetland, we can actually say that, you know, we've got a dock that's non-conforming. It's got these, you know, this old decking, but is that the wrong word?
Solid decking?
A solid decking. Okay, so it's got it was built in the olden days. Now there's, you know, a lot more things we can do to make it sustainable, to make it better. And we are proposing to remove the dock from the wetland, pull some of that debris out of, you know, the wetland area and put it in a place where it's outside the wetland. So we have taken a positive action to mitigate for the impact of a new dock, which would be coming. But we've done the best that we can to, you know, make a good case for how, like Kenny said, we're doing the least impactful thing as possible. So, right, so when we talk about mitigation, sometimes it really is for every square foot of development impact within any of these encumbered areas, we need to identify an equivalent square foot of restoration that we can do. Okay, great.
And in the packet on page 6, there's a chunk of it, if you need reference later on to
Right.
remember that.
Okay, so planned demolition. So demolition and site preparation is a key part of this project. And some of that is because the funding that we have, that was the first series of RCO grants that the city got to purchase the property, necessitates that structures 1 through 4 be taken down. So those need to be demolished anyway. The 2 docks, we have the northern dock, which needs to be demolished. And then there is the lower dock. So currently the dock on the preserve property, you can see it crosses over a wetland that kind of, you know, is associated with the mouth of Lion Creek. It doesn't allow for water access because that is a specific prohibition of the conditions on the Lion Creek property. And it is very close to the mouth of the creek itself. So if we want to provide a dock, which the community asked for, that people can recreate on, we would be basically placing it close to the preserve dock. And then we would have 2, but that's twice as much maintenance and operational costs. And I don't know if you have been out there, but we're starting to see some issues with that dock in terms of the tree encroachment and the buckling of the boards. Yeah, so there is, it is going to be in need of maintenance sooner than a new facility would. And so some of what we have proposed is we've got 2 docks that are not made for the purpose of what this park will be. And so in terms of what we can do for mitigation is we can remove those docks. So now instead of saying we're adding dock square footage necessarily, we might say we're trading it for a better facility that's located, gives more space to the creek, gives more space to the wetlands, et cetera. So in terms of a proposed demo plan and a proposed site preparation plan, this is, you know, where we're starting at. And we're already now starting with essentially $1 million project cost, just related to that work. Now, in terms of the pricing, they basically said, you've got X square footage in the park, we'll assume that you're doing some sort of soil prep, site prep for the whole thing. That's not necessarily true. We have a lot of drip lines of trees that will stay. The lawn itself will be protecting and preserving in place because of it being the shoreline, we wouldn't be able to put in a new lawn. So we would be keeping that. There's a lot of great vegetation within the preserve. So this cost is likely high, but it's what we're using for planning so that we can, again, target those main cost drivers and then spin those down. Okay, so here's our design concept strategy. So basically we designed this as a kit of parts. There's 9 design areas. 6 of those areas have a site plan or programmatic option. So on the puzzle in front of you, we've got a couple of site plan options. And you'll see that several of them have a checkbox. So for example, the lakefront shelter, when we went to the community, they all said picnic shelter. That was what the community wanted. And so there are design options for that. And those are represented in that checkbox, but the site plan doesn't change. It's a shelter and it's going to be located there because of the mitigation impacts and constraints. We wouldn't be able to move it. Okay. And then we've got 3 areas that have basically a single site plan concept. So the preserve is one of these. Our best case for mitigation is to retreat slightly out of the preserve and do restoration in that location. Now, the reason that that's advantageous is because there was pressure on the preserve to provide outdoor recreation because it was the only space for it. Now we have this great space, and so by centering the use more onto the new property, we can take the things that people loved about the preserve and turn those up a little bit. So what we heard was quiet sitting. People love sitting at the end of the dock. They loved watching the creek. And we heard a lot of people say, well, you know, if you walk down the trail and someone's already using the preserve, then, you know, you kind of wait and because they're already on the dock. So what we've done is change it a little bit so that now we have multiple quiet sitting creek, you know, interacting spaces. But the things like the trail on the south side of the creek, we're proposing to restore that. So there's a number of changes we'll discuss specifically there, but there are things that we can talk about related to design. One site plan, multiple design changes that we can make, and that those would be things that we would discuss in the next stage. Okay, so we're going to start with reviewing the building options. So there are a lot of things in this park. It's got, you know, a great site. It's a beautiful natural area, lots of visual and scenic assets. But there are decisions that we will want to make based on what happens with the structure program. And so, Jack, do you want me to give the high view and then you answer questions? Okay,
Go for it.
that sounds great. Okay. So what we heard from the city council, from you guys as a body, from the community is that a flexible space for the community that can be a rental retreat space, you know, providing this community flexible space is really the decision for the program. That was one voice with kind of fine changes to it, but by and large, that's what we heard. And so what we provided are cost feasible options that can get you that in a couple different iterations. So this is a park with a swimming beach, which means it will be required to have a bathroom. It is also something that people asked for, was a restroom. And so what we basically have identified is that, you know, all of these structures on the site have utility, and the garage actually has a toilet in it, funny enough. So in terms of looking at, well, what can we do with these options? Whatever happens inside the big house is going to determine the bathroom capacity that's required. And so the big house drives the bathroom. So you've got one of those sort of linked alternatives there. We also have a deck. So the deck options that I'll be presenting, those can work with any program for the big house. So you can go with large interior and then smaller deck or vice versa, etc. So cabin six is that, if I go back up to this guy, oops, that is a delay. So cabin 6 is this one right here. Looking at providing a parking area, if we provide a loop that allows us to bring in school buses, allows emergency vehicles to turn around, allows for fire, adding additional parking spaces means that we cannot keep cabin 6. So we can go with a smaller parking area and keep cabin 6, or we can go with a smaller parking area and not keep cabin 6. So that's, again, one of those things that we can iterate on. And then the lakefront shelter. So again, programmed as a picnic shelter, and then we have some structured design options related to that one. Okay, so for our building options, based on our cost pricing, we're in the $1 million to $2 million range, and that's for all of those things together. So cabin 6, big house options, structure options, we're looking at a $1 to $2 million architecture cost. So in terms of the options for the big house, there's a small, medium, large, and I've kind of highlighted the areas that they change in. Jack, do you want to present these?
Sure. The small option is small in two ways. You can see to the bottom of the sheet there, what was the garage and now it's proposed as the public restroom. Okay, so that's a 2-toilet, 2-hole restroom with 2 sinks. So that's sort of the smallest option for that. The big house, which is the larger footprint up to the right, remains relatively undemoed. So I wish I could point, but there's a little utility room to the left that has a door in it right there. Yes, we're keeping that in this instance, and the other 2, it goes away. It's not necessarily part of the original structure, and it's not really very usable, and it makes the entrance a little bit narrow and, you know, sad. So in the other 2 options, we are removing it. This one, we're keeping it. The kitchen itself is staying in the same general location as where it exists today. We would put a new kitchen in, but it would essentially be in the same area that it is today. We're also, and this is kind of a nuance, but to the bottom of the kitchen and then across the building over to the other wall, we're keeping a little bit of structure, existing structure there in order to make spans smaller and to be able to hide new structure within those main walls. In the other options, you will see that it goes away. The glazing is primarily the same. Now the windows would be replaced, but they would be essentially in the same geometries that they exist today, both on the newer wood portion to the top and the brick portion to the bottom. The only change, as far as that's concerned in this scheme, is that we would have a larger, and you can just make it out, sliding glass door out to a deck. And this is one of the options for the deck. It's the smaller option for the deck that replaces what is now a Dutch door, solid wood Dutch door in that location. So that's the main sort of gist for the small option.
Can you talk about the second floor? And
Oh, yes. In the second, so the second floor is not accessible. The stair is, doesn't meet current code. It's too steep. When you are up there, all of the rooms exist within a compromised sort of ceiling condition where they're in the attic, essentially. So in all of these options, and you can see in the top left building section there, we are vaulting the ceiling. So we're removing the ceiling from the first level and we're vaulting the ceiling. As part of that, and I should probably mention this, we're doing seismic and structural upgrades to the building anyway. It needs it anyway, but as part of that, we would also address the vaulting of the roof in these areas. It does a number of things which we think is beneficial to the project. One is it makes it a bit more the scale of what you would think a community space would be. It also brings more light in, and I think we'll get more light just by removal of some of the vegetation, but it brings more light in as well. And you'll see in some of the other options that we add more glazing to do that as well. And currently, if you've been in there, the ceiling on the first level is lower than what we typically have in sort of modern homes, and it feels a little bit squashed. So that's just sort of a design move we've taken from small, medium, and large.
I don't
So,
think we went inside on the tours,
Yeah.
look in the windows, but
Yes.
I don't, so, but this is helpful, I don't think I've seen a floor plan of so it's helpful for me just to.
And just for so the existing is essentially, it's divided into sort of that upper large room, the kitchen, which is divided off. The wall that we've sort of left remnants of there is much more enclosed. And then where you see what's in the middle there is a very nice large old fireplace. There's a wall there as well. So it's partitioned up a lot more than what we're
so
showing.
if you go into this packet, the very back page is the demo of that structure. And so that shows how divided up that space is. And so we did go with the city council members and look in that house, and even with just the group of, I think it was, 8 or a dozen of us, it felt full. Yeah, and so imagining, something like a scout meeting or a baby shower or a, right, exactly. That it, with those low ceilings, with the broken up room space, yeah, exactly. And so thinking about, should we provide an option that showed retention of the second floor? We knew it was going to be additional expense. For it to be accessible on the second floor, it would require a lift. We also talked about, what about the programming of those things? So are you renting out the second floor with the first? Would we be keeping a restroom up there? If we were using the top as offices, you would want to keep a restroom. And then we started to think about, okay, now we've got 2 spaces, maybe programmed separately. What if you have a scout meeting and you have, Corey's office upstairs? Is it working? And does it feel like that's the best use of the investment of dollars? And so by and large, it felt like the goal of making this a flexible, usable, open space that held a group nicely, that removing the second floor was the clear best option in terms of design program.
So the space now very much look like the hangar in Kenmore. With the fireplace in the middle.
So some of the things that we've talked about in terms of, okay, now we know kind of the bones of the work. What's the next stage of that design that we're doing to say, this is still of this site? We've got the garage, we've got these other story, structures that are coming down partially. We would love to see a lot of that material, the old growth timber, the finished, the little fixtures and things be reused in some of these projects. So we talked about reusing the brick in ways through paving through the site. We talked about doing, one idea that I love is, and it is reflected as a high-end finish for the ceiling, is to reuse the old growth timber from the carport and use that as, facing on the interior of the ceiling of the structure. And being able to then say, for one, we can get funding for reuse of materials. For two, we can say that this material has been on this property for over 100 years. And that's a really neat story to say that, yeah, we changed the structure, but we did our best to keep it true to Lake Forest Park and to the history of the site. So there are a lot of those types of things that, again, when we move to that next stage, we can bring that back in. And so I think those concerns about, okay, but if we change it this much, is it gonna feel like us, or will it be, something else? And I think there's definitely things that we can do to make sure that it keeps the tone of what encouraged you guys to keep the architecture in the first place.
Yeah, I would just add to that no matter what we do, I think that celebrating the existing house is like the first thing. But we need to make it usable and, beautiful, and a place that people want to go, and would be like the hearth for the community. But the existing fireplace is really very nice, and it's massive, so removing it would be a lot of money anyway.
It's
But
beautiful.
keeping it is really an asset, I think, to the project.
That's
Okay,
the one in the middle of that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just the backside of that, in this.
Currently, it's plaster. We don't really
What would it
know,
be?
but I'm assuming it's the same brick that's on the face, because it does appear to be that way. When you get a glimpse of it coming out of the roof. But currently, we don't know that for sure, but
Right.
that's my guess.
I'm gonna skip us forward in the interest of time.
Yep.
So the medium program, just, do you wanna go?
I can do it really quick.
Awesome.
So it's
Love it.
pretty much the same as the last one. I'll go through what's different. We've changed the kitchen to the top to make it more of a single run. It gives more space to program. So it's still very usable, but gives more space to program. We put a little pantry back down to the south to the bottom of the page. And we do include in this version an accessible restroom within the house. So you don't have to leave the house to get to a restroom, which I think is really great for convenience and for accessibility. Down where the garage was and where we're adding public restrooms, you can see that we've added 2 more toilets. So the 4 toilets is what the max capacity, if we had an assembly use in the big house, that you would be required to provide. So we're showing that as an option in the medium and the large option. And outside of that, this is a nuance, but you can see, and we'll talk about it a little bit in the cost estimate. We did a large roof, which is the dashed outline that leader is pointing to right there, so that you're covered from going from the house to the restroom. What we didn't understand was that was actually pretty expensive, and so the medium option is actually slightly more expensive than the large option, which was, it's $12,000, but still, because there's a little bit more square footage of that roof in this option, it ended up actually negating the stuff we were doing on the interior.
Right, and
of the large
assuming
option.
that, and understanding that we have a percent contingency of 20%,
Yeah.
we're within that margin.
Well,
And so it is essentially is a nominal cost change between the medium and the large options based on that roof option. So we'll do, the decks are in separate slides, so we'll just
Yep.
go large house now.
And just all of you, if I write that all of these take down part of the garage structure?
Yes, so the garage is like a Franken structure. It's got like the back, which is the old brick, and that's where it has, some of the plumbing, and then it's got the new wood garage front to it. And so when you think about, walking up to the center of the park, and you've got the garage that kind of covers the beginning of the house. If we took that front part off and took it back to the brick part of the structure, then it opens up that front where you start to see the front of the park or the front of the house as part of the entry visual of the park. So that's the intent here, is a partial demo of the garage.
And would there still be slab? Like, I'm wondering if there's usable, if there's space that can be turned into something then, even if it's outdoor space, then, yeah.
Yes, so on your game board here, so we basically have these two options that show the area of where, the big house can be programmed in any of those ways. You can see that the garage structure is pulled back, and then we've essentially used that area to make an entry plaza for the park. Yeah, so it all becomes one part of a sequence. Okay.
All right, and we can go to large, just really quick, I can get
Sure.
through it very fast, Amber. The only thing that's really changed here, public restrooms are pretty much the same. The roof, as we mentioned, changes a little bit between the house and the public restroom. What this does is it moves the kitchen down to the bottom there, and it makes, it provides much more open and programmable space within the existing house footprint. And the last thing that I'll say that it also is relevant to the medium option is we've added much more glazing on the wood portion, which is the uppermost, the top of the sheet portion of the house. So we've added, you know, potentially floor to ceiling glass on the left side and what it would be an operable big glass opening wall on the right side out to the deck. So what's nice about that, besides just making the space nicer and more lit, is that when you come from the entry from the parking lot to the actual park itself, there's more transparency through the house. So you're seeing through the house out to what is the really wonderful view of the beach and the lake.
And so knowing things that, you know, this is a preserve, that we're gonna have habitat there. We have talked about things like, you know, making sure that the windows are bird safe, those types of things. And so those would all be elements of this project if that's the path that we took. Okay, so as you saw on those plans, you saw this deck sort of changing. So now we're gonna talk about the deck options. So currently the home has a deck on the outside of it. And we started thinking, okay, well, what does this offer? So if you're renting the big house space, then you would be inside it. But for most people, the structure will be almost like statuary in the park. It'll be an interesting element, but they won't be inside of it. So how can they share in some of the experiences of that house? And the deck is really the way to do that. So we imagined, okay, so, you know, the structure is locked up. I'm a park recreationist, and you can come and you can sit on the dock, you can look, or sit on the deck, you can look through the trees that frame this beautiful view of the lake. You can picnic up there. You're elevated a little bit, so you have a really nice view in front of you out to the water. And it gives you a way to participate in that experience of being in the house without actually being in the house. So we thought, all right, so let's use the existing deck as sort of a starting point. And so that's what we see as option 2 here, the smaller, the modest deck example. And so we've got basically a cost difference of $190K to $355K. So we've got a good difference there, with the main driver being the deck square footage. So thinking about, all right, if we have a small deck and it sort of mimics the existing footprint, but would need to be accessible, so there's ramps that are happening, there's those types of things. What if we really leaned into the deck experience and said, this is the main way that people coming into the park, they're not walking around the back of the structure sort of comes out to greet them. So when you get to the park, you're starting to walk up that ramp. So this other option is a grand deck. So that's saying, as an asset to the people in the park, this provides a public deck that they can enjoy the scenery, enjoy the sitting, enjoy the experience, but it also changes what renting the structure means. Renting the structure could mean I now have this structure with a fully open wall and access to the deck for my, you know, evening retreat or something. So it becomes a better value in terms of the space that you guys would have to rent as a community. So lots of options for things like, oop, that's wrong. Okay. So we've got our deck with the grand program. So this is looking at the deck area. We've got ramps. We are not through our grading exercises for this park, so these ramps may change, the incline might change. The stairs we imagine as a grand stair, but it does provide a sense of the difference that we're talking about in size. You can see that comparative area to the house. This is nearly as large as the floor plan. One thing that a deck does for us also is that the stormwater drainage for this park, stormwater engineering drainage, will have to, you know, treat everything, capture everything, all of that sort of stuff. Lion Creek is a stormwater receiving body. we are allowed to take our stormwater and drain it directly into the creek. But the ethos of this park and what we've heard from everyone is that they don't want that that's not what the community seems like they would be jazzed about us doing. And so what we would propose is let's do better than what's expected in the regulation when it comes to stormwater. So capture what we can, treat what we can, and do that before ultimately cleaner water runs into the creek. And one of the ways that we can do that is through like vaults, which are very expensive. They're either above ground and you're looking at them, or they're below ground and they're twice as expensive. So one thing that the deck does for us is it allows us to have the visual of buried treatment with it not actually being underground. It would just be under the deck structure. And so in that case, this area, this location would likely take like the roof runoff from the structure, hold it in a little tank, settle it a little bit, and then we would look at, dispersing cleaner water. So it would be part of a larger stormwater program. It wouldn't solve all of our problems, but it is one of those things that the deck can help us do. So the modest deck program, much smaller, much more similar to the deck that is there currently, and then it would of course have a ramp that would allow it to be accessible. So cabin 6, essentially we looked at those options for the demo. What if we put parking? We can't keep cabin 6 in both of those scenarios. So these are your parking lot tiles. Your sort of two options here that show cabin 6, Captain cabin 6 going. In terms of what it makes sense to program cabin 6 as, opening up as office space would provide another flexible, unprogrammed space that the city could choose to, operate as they wanted. It could be overflow office space. A suggestion that came out was having maybe a community policing office there. So just providing a space that would not necessarily, it would again not be open to the public. Artisan residence was mentioned by the community members. It would be a flexible space that would add to that programming and community-based programming for the park. And it would really be a keep it or don't keep it type of program. So there's basically one option for cabin 6, and it's it stays or it goes. If it stays, we wouldn't be able to do the maximum, the more parking scenario. So there's that as well. So the lakefront shelter. So again, we heard picnic pavilion. And what we have here are a couple different design options that show some different examples. And then we have some costs of what, cost implications of something like a more complicated design to a more simple design. One thing to note about these is the footprint. So we do have about the same footprint. So here's the existing plan. So about the same footprint, smaller than footprint. And so in this case, that, reduction in area is one of those cost drivers, but this also then would provide another option or another opportunity for mitigation to say we've given back 20 feet of this structure. So one thing to think about. Jack, did you want to make any mention of these things, or?
The only thing I would say is that please don't get hung up with the aesthetics. I think that if we chose the simple one, we could still do a folded roof, or we could add a wall or a chimney or something like that to the simple version. It's not necessarily the architecture that's driving those costs, it's more the size and what's inside of them that's driving those costs.
Inside, in what way?
Well, inside meaning like, is there a wall, is there a chimney? I think we provided electrical outlets for pumping up your portable watercraft. I don't remember if we did anything for kayak storage in these, but
No, that's the other spot, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Mhm.
The sink, outdoor shower.
Mhm.
Associated with these, so there's bits of program pieces that are also associated with these.
So the location of this structure, when you look at, the site plan itself, you can see that this structure, once the fence comes down along the property line, this is centrally located waterfront structure. So you can imagine, picnicking, eating at the tables, kids running back and forth between the lawn, a foot wash, people filling up, water bottles, instant pots plugged in for potluck, those types of things. That being the center for that, again, flexible waterfront activity. And that it would be a defining characteristic when you're viewing the park from the shoreline. And again, Jack has the chimney as reused here. We have a lot of brick that's gonna come down from some of those demoed structures. So those can be things that we can reuse in site walls, that we can, if it's not the chimney structure, then as he's saying, there's lots of design decision making that we can make later on.
The chimney would just be for a barbecue or something, or is that?
Yeah, keep it warm.
Fire pit, it could
Yeah.
be a barbecue, we don't have to have one, but there is one currently there.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
One of the things that's great about this spot is, I mean, we can build there still, which is nice, so close to the water. But it's also shelter, it's not always nice out, and I can imagine that would be a nice spot to hang out if it starts to rain. Yeah, exactly.
and as far as our ability to put a structure any closer to the water is pretty nil. Right? I mean, we can't relocate this and have an easy permitting time.
Well, that's where the code is a little bit subjective. And that's what makes it hard, because if we can demonstrate adequately to the city that there's no other place to put it, that still kind of fulfills project purpose and the goals of the programming, then it could be justified, but
Okay.
it's very subjective.
Wizard. Okay, so now we're gonna hop into the design areas with single site plan concepts. So we've got the city hall to the Burke Gilman Trail. So when we started this project, we knew that there was an interest in providing parking in the city hall parking lot and then safe pedestrian connections between city hall and here, which is where the current Lion Creek preserved parking spaces are. So we have looked at that condition and we have provided recommendations to the city. We heard a lot from the residents on Beach Drive. We heard a lot from the community about where they felt safe in the approach to the park. So you remember the exercise from the with the dots. There are improvements to be made. And we can either decide that those are project costs. We would be on the timeline of the Sound Transit projects, and we would be on the timeline of washed up roofs. So that means that if we were saying, whatever they do with Sound Transit, we're gonna come in and we're gonna redo this intersection. We're talking many, many millions of dollars and a very long process to get that happening. And so the decision was made that the design team, led by Jeff and Kirk's team, provided recommendations on what could be done to reestablish U-turn in the intersection, which would then keep people from U-turning onto Beach Drive, to maybe widen the crosswalk, to widen the path approach. We also worked on, what is the future of that area adjacent to City Hall where the designated turn lane are? What is that gonna look like according to the Sound Transit plans, and how would we iterate on that? So how can we say, hey, you're going this far, why don't we just do this other thing? And then have that be part of it. So those have been provided to the city, and we're hoping that the city is, the city can make traction, but they're definitely coordinating with the stakeholders on those projects. And so for now, those improvements are outside of the costs for this project, which will allow this project to sort of finish on its own terms. Chips will fall where they may, based on what Sound Transit and WashDOT are doing. And then if there's other things that need to happen after that time, that would be a bridge to cross at that point. Okay, so right of way is another thing. We have one site plan concept for the right of way, so Ballinger Way and Beach Drive, and that is basically because we are held to the code requirement. So we don't have a whole lot of options for that, where there's really just one, and it's to meet standards. Safe approach, meet standards. The next is the waterfront preserve, which I mentioned. So we've got one program for site plan, but a lot of different ways that we can iterate on that through the design. So the big thing about it is that it maintains the restrictions on water access. So we actually better accomplish the conditions that were put on the park in its initial, the preserve in its initial approval. We do aim to reduce potential for degradation to the preserve, despite increasing recreational opportunities on the Turner property, which that's what we heard from a lot of people as well, is, packing this many people into the park, the preserve is so sensitive. And so it does make sense to retreat a little bit, control the access and impact on the park by making those changes. And then those options that we'll have are about planting scheme and experience. This was one of those areas where the community was sort of divided. We heard a lot from the community saying, when the prior work happened at the preserve, too many trees came out. And then we heard a lot of people saying, when I loved how it was opened up, and then now it's overgrown. And so we've got the view preservation versus sort of forested camp. And so what we can take to the community in terms of a decision is, you know, how might the preserve be restored as a mitigation action to allow us to do this other development and to get more of a planting experience, more of a nature-based preserve experience that the community is wanting. And then the last is the central area. So this is the area that sort of connects everything. It's kind of between everything. There's options for play structures, finishers, that sort of thing that we can discuss when we get to that. So
Just a time check, we're at 8:10.
8:10, okay, perfect. A little timer ticking away there at the bottom. 50 minutes left of this meeting. Okay, so here's the recommendations to that we provided to the city. Jeff, do you want to give a 30-second, 2-minute, or do you want me to go over them and then you can be expert question answer?
No, you could go for it, Amber.
Okay, that sounds great. All right, oh, 2 Jeffs, okay. So essentially, we've got the journey to the park, starting with our front door to the park experience, starting with those existing spaces for the preserve, so the dedicated few that are there. Currently, it's a pretty narrow sidewalk, and it basically puts you out in this area, kind of coming on at the side of that lane. With the reconfiguration, the addition of the stop, the proposed, you know, plans, not the final plans for Sound Transit, but the improvements that they're making, that becomes a narrow sidewalk that doesn't line up with the program. And so what the recommendation that we made was to widen that into a path, so a 10-foot wide path that leaves the parking area and really comes down a little bit closer to the corner where the new curb ramp will be, that it's a nice wide crossing across that lane, that it again is a wider path. So if you're imagining a group, a family, poolers, you know, pool equipment, that sort of stuff, coming across this way, we wanted to provide as much refuge space here as was feasible, while still keeping the tree and those types of things, and still working within the, you know, the proposed plan that Sound Transit is committed to making in terms of their improvements, based on them being not completely done. I think there was the suggestion to widen this crosswalk slightly with the striping, and that was something that would be worked on with WashDOT. And then, okay, so in this area, I've got, this is covered by my Zoom, so my apologies, my pointing is a little funny here, but essentially right now, their horizontal width from this curb, or I guess from this lane to this curb, is too narrow to allow a legal U-turn. And so we heard a lot of feedback about how down the road where there was a gap that was closed and U-turns were not allowed there, or left turns were not allowed, basically increased the demand for making U-turns here, but you can't. So people are turning onto Beach Drive, making a wide circle right here. We heard it from the Civic Club. We heard it from Beach Drive. We experienced it while we were standing in this intersection, and that it was very common, and then going back this way. So in order to allow that legally, it would have to be expanding this to 52 feet, which would require moving this curb. Not a huge deal, except that there are utility vaults and there are the utilities associated with the traffic signal at that location. So it becomes a more expensive proposition. So it's something that, again, not in the project budget, sort of moving on its own course, coordination between, you know, Soundtrack, and this is actually in the, I think this is in and adjacent to the King County right of way. So there's a handful of other interests looking at this, but it is moving ahead, but it won't be represented in the project cost or the presentation to the community, essentially. Okay, so the right of way, the safety and code compliance, that's what we need to accomplish here. So our project in terms of cost really starts at where the sidewalk and curb ramp for the Burke Gilman are. We would propose a new sidewalk to extend down to Beach Drive, a striped crossing to keep people there instead of kind of feeding across the intersection like they do currently. And then within the right of way, a length of sidewalk all the way down to the park entrance. Now, our goal here would be sidewalk to the park entrance. There is a chance that we might be required for the city code to bring it across the whole frontage, and then it would essentially just pour out onto Beach Drive because it doesn't connect to anything. So we are very sensitive to the impacts of this project and the adjacent owner. So their structure just off of this frame, you can see where the yellow line is, where it basically says 3, is right there at the property line. The eave of their house actually appears from the survey to be slightly over the property line. And so bringing that sidewalk straight down, for one, it's project cost, but it may be a requirement. For two, it's that we are really putting people very close to that structure in a space that currently is protected by the existing carport, which we are obligated to remove because of the funding. So there's a handful of things that we're trying to orchestrate here to, like Kenny said, make sure that we are doing the best that we can to make this a reasonable project to go into a residential zone. Okay, so estimated cost for sidewalk improvements to the right of way, we're looking at between 140, 150. All right, so the preserve area. So this is our single site plan option. So that's the one on the base map here for your plan. What we are proposing in this area is to retreat off of the south bank. So if you've been out there recently and you look kind of across, you can see where the creek has widened a little bit, and it actually is starting to undermine the fence on the Civic Club property. And that's just past where the trail ends. So we also know that from the flood capacity work that happened, increasing floodplain to the park, we do have flooding. So there's a dynamic system, it floods, it overtops, it actually closes some of the path when it's really flooded. It's designed to do that. So what we've provided is basically reconfiguring to create multiple experiences of sitting at the end of the dock in a quiet space. Retreating from that south bank, being able to call all of that restoration, mitigation for the work that happens to the north. Coming off of the south bank, which is already starting to be stressed and undermined on that property line with the Civic Club, so giving it some space there. And providing buffer to the Civic Club, which we know that with use of the preserve, there has been some trespass issues onto the Civic Club property. And so trying to do the best thing by saying, this is a preserve, this is the park. And so really directing people to use it in that way. So what you'll notice in this image is that this bridge that's currently there is not there. What we're proposing to do is actually take that bridge and relocate it. Use it with the existing deck that is there, reface the deck. We would keep the opening because I think it's actually quite fun. But then we would propose a new railing that's contiguous from one feature to the next. So you would actually imagine that when this flooded, the creek would swell, it would flood under this bridge, it would flood around this platform, and so it wouldn't ever result in a seasonal closure of the park infrastructure. It would be open all the time and you would be flooded around. Now, this would be a kind of an out and around and back. And it also looks, from the visuals from some of our renderings and sketches, it looks quite beautiful to be sort of looking down that column of the park and seeing the bridge, over the floodplain, and having that be an interesting feature. So some of the other things we added here, we've got split rail fencing, so it allows wildlife to pass. It won't keep anyone out, but it is a really clear signal to say you're not supposed to go any farther. And so we do have some of those additions here as well. So here's some visuals of what we anticipate, what we're kind of imagining. We would look at replacing the decking with things, graded decking. This is an example of just little platforms with, no railing. Some may have railing depending on what the grading is, but thinking about this as being the structure program for the preserve itself. And then these being more of a, shrubbed, forested riparian versus something more of like an open floodplain meadow as being some of the design options that we can discuss with the public.
And did you say there's a parking structure?
Oh, so there is a pad here. That's,
Okay.
right, so there's a, yes, so there's an ADA stall, there's like a gate when you go into the preserve. Do you remember that where you like walk up?
I'm trying to remember.
Okay.
I remember a big garage that's on.
Oh, the carport, yes, so that's actually, the carport is actually located here. So we're right now in Lion Creek Waterfront Preserve. So these are, yeah.
So when you said parking structure, I didn't understand where in
Okay.
relation to the preserve where you were referring to.
Okay, I may have misspoke.
Did anybody? I'm
Are
sorry.
you just talking about the sidewalk? Is that what you're
She
thinking of?
just said parking structure and I went, wait a minute, what parking structure in the preserve? No, that can't be.
Oh,
So I'm sorry, I
Okay.
probably, maybe I was first, but. What'd you say?
Parking area.
Parking area. Okay.
right, so that's the current paved area that's here.
Yeah,
And so what we did use is, so the minimum buffer for this creek is 70 feet. It is actually wider, but we can make some case and argument as to why we can respect the 70 feet buffer. It's the most sort of constraining encumbrance that we have in this whole park project. And so what we have done here is use the existing paved area for the creation of a new drive. And so we're trying to minimize new paving. We're trying to, you know, obviously there's some circulation for the park paths here, but again, they're retreating closer to the, you know, center of activity, more farther away from the creek. And one thing you can see here as well that we did do is take that dock off of the preserve parcel, and where the new dock, where we're proposing the new dock to be located, it still has those overlooks that provide another perspective of the creek mouth. So it still provides that quiet overwater view that people love about the preserve today.
And is the overlook that you had at the end there, that's where the dock is right now, is that right?
Yes, so yes, and that's one of the next options, just extending off the page with that extension on it.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
sort of orienting myself.
Yep. Okay, and so you can see here that the estimated cost for the preserve work is close to $1 million. Now, this is based on them saying there's this many square feet in the preserve. We're assuming that there's going to be invasive removal, site prep, replanting of a lot of this. And so the paths, moving the bridge, some of this, you know, fencing, that has a cost for sure. But I do think that based on the amount of planting that we would be keeping, site prep that we would not be doing, that this cost is likely high for this work. But it's one of those things where now we know what the main drivers of cost are. We can tune those down as we move forward with design work.
And invasive removal, I assume, could also be a volunteer project.
Could be, yes.
There is a lot of expertise and interest.
Right, and if we can mobilize some of that, there's times when you can count that as an in-kind donation to support a grant. So if matching funds are required, we can demonstrate and document, which the documentation is not a light lift for some of that. But if we can say, you know, it's 100 volunteer hours, that can be an in-kind match to help us secure other funding. So there's also mechanisms like that we can do. The best thing that we can do is price it well and ask for enough money. But that's a great strategy when we actually find out what some of those awards are, you know, as those decisions are made. Okay, so the central area. So this is the area that basically joins the parking lot all the way out to the dock. This is if you look on the virtual site tour online, or if you remember being in the park, there's those two large trees with those very thick bamboo beds underneath them. It's the view from the structure from this point looks through that canopy straight out of the lake. It's a really nice visual. Now, all of that bamboo would need to go. It kind of represents an ongoing maintenance issue, but keeping the trees to frame that view would be quite nice. And so thinking about how people will recreate at this park and people asking for a play structure, we thought that that space under the shade of those two existing mature trees would be a really nice way to use that space, to program it, to do a nature-based play experience, and to not be doing something that would get us really into the soil and into the root zones of that trees that would then jeopardize them staying. We also imagined, you know, picnicking on the deck, watching your kids at the structure and kind of looking out at the water as being a really nice experience where you're in that, you know, lake forest park experience. I know. And so of course the structure, a nature-based play experience, something like, you know, these log structures that are here, we thought would go well with the tone. It was something that we heard from the public comment. It also is low, which means that it's not going to impede the view, which is nice. So we don't have a visual obstruction, especially because you'll be up higher on the deck. So you'll be looking over the top of it. And then in terms of the kind of path area here, so this area is one of the structures existing. And what we're proposing to do is basically renovate this into a staging area. So we actually are proposing, we would love to have an automated air pump. So one that catches your eye, so people don't get out of their car and start with the hand pump. You know, there'll be other opportunity for the pump closer to the water when people need it. But when you're loading and unloading, we're imagining this being a conspicuous place where people can unload, put their kayak in the rack, lock up their bike, do whatever. I guess you may not have a bike on a car, but, and then go park at City Hall, come back, and then get back into your activities. So a nice space that uses that existing paving pad that's there for the structure that has to be torn down based on the grant requirements. So this is a nice wide path that we're proposing from the parking area all the way down to the dock. That doubles as a vehicle, an emergency vehicle egress path. So it would be a vehicle rated, you know, wide path that would allow an emergency vehicle to pull right in and go straight to the dock if they need to. And so that path then for that use serves the whole park. makes it more expensive than just a sidewalk that people walk on, but very, very necessary in terms of the programming of the park here. So let's see, anything that I'm missing in the central area?
I got this slider pin at home and my 4-year-old walked by and he looked at the picture and he said, I want to go to that playground.
That's exactly the reception that we're hoping to get. Oh, okay, so this one, so item number 2 here. I don't know, do any of you guys remember this tree? It is the very large, yes, it's a beautiful one that's there. So we really wanted,
Has the treehouse in it, or?
no, it's,
That's the next one.
right, it's the Coast Redwood, the one that's, 6-7 feet across at the base. It's, according to our arborist, it's in good health, it's a beautiful tree. Being up next to it is pretty amazing, and so we thought as just a little bench seating area, getting people to see that tree and be underneath it and, give it a hug, all of those fun things. That's really what is represented there. It's just a little plaza. We thought that could be a nice place for interpretation. It could be a nice place for some sort of art integration. So art, we can think about, art is an object that you put in space. It can also be something that is, intricately designed in the pavement. So it still stays in flexible space. It still gives us room for something beautiful that's part of the park, makes it graffiti resilient in that way, less likely to be, defaced, those types of things, and doesn't take up any of the occupiable space within the park, which this will be a beautiful opened up space, but it still is not 4 acres, And so we need to be strategic with those types of things that we're putting in that actually occupy that room. Okay, and then some of the ideas that we had here were more reuse of some of the brick from elsewhere on the site, of how that could, be incorporated into the creation of this central area and plaza. So lots of design decisions, lots of opportunity for cost management, but really one site program option that kind of brings everything together. Okay, so the site plan options, parking and entrance, beach area, and the dock. So these are the ones that are represented by tiles here on the map. So parking and entrance, we basically provide a more and a minimum scenario, assuming that majority of the parking is going to be at City Hall. There are operational limitations that could be imposed on parking. So if we provide parking spaces, they could be signed as permit only. They could be signed as load and unload only. They could be signed as 90-minute max. So that's an operational thing. The cost and the construction would be parking spaces. So there's decisions to be made even in just how this park will be managed that go beyond the design work that we'd be doing now. So beach area, as Kenny mentioned, there's some S&P concerns. One thing that you'll see that's not really visible in these is we're proposing a buoy line. So a swimming area delineation on that north property. We don't want to draw people to the attractive, nuisance thing. We don't want to draw people onto the neighbor's property, even though their dock is really nice. So making sure that we have a clear delineation of park area versus non-park area would be important to make sure the park is successful. And then we would assume no swimming south of the dock. So where the dock is, south is the preserve. No swimming south of the dock. And so we would propose something like a railing or some sort of delineation on the south side of that dock. And then the dock removes those, condemned and aging structures. It divides the water area. And one of the important things is that it really retreats from the wetland that's located where the current one is. And then it also moves the dock off of the preserve parcel. Okay, so here are the 2 options for parking. So that's those tiles there. You guys are welcome to turn this. Okay. So we have what we call the more parking and a minimum parking. So the minimum parking requirement, we know based on the decisions that are made from the structure, we will be required to have somewhere between 3 and 5 accessible spaces. So the minimum parking would be 3 to 5 accessible spaces. And this, we would also provide something like a service bay, which you can see at the kind of north side of this picture. And
Load zone, like something.
it could be a load zone, could also just be fire or a park maintenance vehicle, that no one is supposed to park there, essentially. Yeah. And then this orientation does allow us to keep cabin 6. So cabin 6, yes, no, and then we have a minimum parking option. This is the more parking option. So it's not meant to represent the most parking that we could fit at the park. When we had the community workshop, we put out lots of parking space tiles and nobody used all of them. Some people used just a couple, a lot of people used, right around 5 to 8, something like that. So people understand that the more parking that we provide, the less park that we have. And so I think in terms of this could mean that this is made a little bit smaller, but this is really the more that reasonably we can fit on the site, provides a workable entrance, it's cost reasonable, and it doesn't compromise our ability to provide the other things in the park. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm gonna keep zipping through until people raise their hands, which we go. All right, so the beach area.
There's just
Yes,
quick on
sure.
that parking.
Yeah.
We've talked about having like school bus loading and unloading. Is that comparable between either of these, that you just sort of pull into the area between?
Yeah.
The bus drives out?
So this is designed where we have the minimum requirements for fire truck turnaround, bus turnaround, but this is also not a construction plan. So there's gonna be, we just got the survey that we've got to communicate with the city on the requirements for the right of way. So there will be tweaks and bends to this, but in terms.
One or the other doesn't
Yes.
change that option.
Right, but the base program of utility vehicles, kayak outfitter, kind of food truck pull-in, those types of things. If those are important, then those will be things that we make sure represent the condition in the design. But what we would want to know is, are we designing for the more parking, the better? Or are we designing for the minimum required and everything else parks at City Hall? Okay,
I
and
think it
so the
also
top.
comes down to keeping the cabin or not.
Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
yes. So if there is a desire to keep cabin 6, it really puts us in the minimum parking scenario.
Yeah.
If we are okay with the minimum parking scenario, and that's really the goal, then we don't have to keep cabin 6. Cabin 6 is a yes, no. But if more parking is what's necessary, then we do lose cabin 6 pretty much off the bat.
And the planted area and that's preserving trees, and it's
Yes.
also part of stormwater management.
Right, yes. So currently there's mature trees here. There's also a power pole. There's also a lot of utility. And so do we want to pull all of that stuff out and get into that and spend money on those types of things and relocating that? Or do we work around and with what's there and try and, work around it essentially?
Is there any alternative to removing cabin 6 other than more parking?
Absolutely. So, if we went with this no parking or so on the parking
Minimum
lot one,
parking.
right, this one. So basically, you can choose a minimum park scenario and you can still demolish cabin 6. And then it becomes plaza, it becomes something that we could program in the entrance. Yeah, so there's still more that we can do. We don't have to keep cabin 6 just because we're going with the minimum
Okay.
park scenario.
That's
Of course. Okay. So there would be cost implications, of course, to not keep cabin 6. Cabin 6, we're looking at a reno cost of like $250, something like that. And so that's money back in the budget if we go slightly smaller parking. Now, what we did notice is that the difference between these two parking areas as shown is not great. It's more paving in one. In the other one, it's actually more pedestrian plaza, which is more expensive than asphalt paving. It's also more landscaping. So it's not like it's just a, parking cost reduction. You have to fill that space that's not parking with other things. And based on the way it's currently programmed, the cost change is, not huge. Okay, so the beach area. So one of the really wonderful things about relocating that Turner structure, the Turner property dock, is that it allows the beach to be one contiguous space. And so you get this nice wide beach that feels twice as wide as it is currently. We would not be able to put in a big lawn like that necessarily. It's looked at as an impact. So the fact that it's there already, what we would basically do is fence it off and say, this is a no-touch zone. You can't, put equipment here, you can't stockpile here, you can't track over it. It stays as it is. And that allows us to keep as much of it as possible, is what we would make the argument for. And there's some risk there, but we think we can make a good case. So as Kenny mentioned, there's some language in the S&P about waterfronts that says swimming areas will be separate from boat launch areas,
Correct.
but it doesn't define a boat. And it doesn't define separated by how. And so what we have here are basically as much beach as we can get, retaining as much lawn as we can get, And moving the dock to its location and basically assuming that boat launching, whatever that is, will happen at the end of the dock. If we want to provide a designated soft launch, which, you know, if you look at beaches like Lake Sammamish State Park, like some of these where you've got the combined activities, one area sort of becomes just a line of kayaks all the way down it. And so by providing an area that basically says, if you're going to launch a kayak, it's over here. That does allow us to kind of contain that use to an area, but it obviously, you know, somewhat decreases the size of the beach. So here's two options for that beach area of how it might look. And then in terms of what we would do to the beach, there is that, there's that shoreline wetland. So there would be some, you know, wetland restoration, some planting, but we would be looking for, planting with native plants and keeping the lawn essentially as is.
So how to have the, I'm sorry,
Oh, no, go ahead.
the, I don't know what they're called, the big concrete blocks. that
Yes.
are going up, we can take those.
So that is a great mitigation action, is to remove that hard armoring from the edge of the lake. And that's something that is, usually a pretty big mitigation.
I'm just trying to visualize the kayaks
Mhm.
scenario in comparing it to Lagoon. There's
Mhm.
two ways to launch your kayak. It's
Mhm.
straight off the beach, and another one is they would Kenmore would place a floating platform by the pier. So
Something
how,
like these.
yeah, is that something that will be a feature also featured as
Mhm.
well in Live Beach?
Yeah, so we looked at that accessible launch as being, thinking about, you know, how the lake works in this area. It's very shallow when we're at the beach. And so being able to provide something like an accessible launch where you actually have like a floating gangway that allows you to station a kayak, get into it, and then kind of push off into the water. You need water to be able to do that. And so it meant pushing it out farther towards the end of the dock. It also gives us separation of boat launching and swimming, because swimming is at the beach and boat launching is at the end of the dock. So again, it's that thing of, you know, the gray area of what is separation, what constitutes boat launching.
Does also mean that bulky boats are moving along that.
Right,
dock.
now, what is a stand-up paddleboard? Is that a boat? Probably not, maybe, and so would we still anticipate people launching stand-up paddleboards from the beach? Probably, and it would probably be fine for us to anticipate that use, depending on how the code is interpreted, right?
That to me sounds like you're talking about just, you have just the beach scenario,
Yes.
people just start organically launching.
Well, like a
on
surfboard,
it.
stand-up paddleboard.
Yeah.
So is that a boat? I would think no, but I am not making the decisions. And so that's one of those things where there's that risk in the approach that we take. We could go separate launch right off the bat, and maybe that's safer to say, this is the soft launch and it's separate from this. Or maybe we start by saying, this is the big beach area, boats will be launched off the dock. And then what happens here is water activities that are not boats. And what does the enforcement of that look like after we have the permit and the project construction?
I would imagine enforcement would. If something formal wasn't constructed, I mean, that to me would be the violation of the intent of the code. I think if people are launching paddleboards from the beach area. Can't speak for the city,
Right.
but I don't know if there'd be a lot of enforcement there. It wouldn't seem like it, but,
Right.
And Civic Club, I have never seen
Yeah.
kayaks or
Oh, yeah,
paddleboards
it's on the.
launch from the beach.
Well, there is an actual boat, like a.
There is a
floating
boat.
trailer.
we have a boat launch, yeah.
So when I've gone kayaking from there, I've carried my kayak out
at the
along
boat
that,
launch,
along that driveway, because there's a
Right.
driveway.
But never at the beach area where the kids.
But there's also buoys that block it up.
Oh, yeah.
People push off from the beach.
They
It
do.
just
On the
like-
other side, yeah.
And it just goes straight through the swimming area. And kids also like to bring kayaks and paddleboards into the swimming area and play on them. So there's,
So do you think we could make a case that the precedent is there? For paddleboards to not be boats, and then we can get into this later. Okay, so in terms of the dock, we basically looked at what is the sort of largest appropriate facility, and then get that priced and then work down from there. Or what is something that's similar to what's there already, but is designed for this type of use. So the two options that we have here for the dock are basically an all activity dock. So one that incorporates all of the things we have on, the dock basically right north of the property line. On the preserve side, we have, some beautiful seating overlooks, like these shown. So they might be edged in a railing to basically say, this is not a swimming area. You're not to be getting off the dock in this direction. But it provides that experience that everybody talked about loving the preserve for, and it provides more of it. So the preserve is never, full necessarily. There's room to get into a quiet corner and have a recreational experience that's in pace with what the preserve is for, what the preserve is about, and advocates for its protection in terms of spacing out those activities and retreating out of the property a bit. So both of the docks basically include that programming for the preserve side. On the larger dock, we assumed more of an integrated swim platform that basically faces the swimming area. So if you imagine walking onto that dock, you've got the railing on the preserve side, the north side is open, it allows you to climb in and climb out of the water. I could imagine on, high beach days, maybe this is where the lifeguard tower sits. And then they have a clear view looking at, it's not a built-in thing, but it is definitely a space that if the city or a community group decided that a lifeguard was necessary for some of these swimming activities, this would be a spot where you could kind of see the whole area out to the swimming buoy. Then farther down in the deeper water, we would have areas for boats to launch, accessible launch. There might be a space for, small rowboats to arrive on the park side, tie up, and then walk in. We're not looking at a vehicular launch. That was not something that the community asked for. It was something that specifically the stakeholders of the city did not advocate for. So the largest program, this is shown at 10 feet wide by 200 feet long. And the dock cost based on the pricing conservatively at this point, with the burden cost and the contingency, is nearly $2 million. So we're at $1.6 million. The largest driver of that is the size of that dock. So again, it's right now we're showing it as 10 by 200. If it comes down to 8 by 180, we've lost a lot of area. And so it helps us to bring that cost down while still providing an integrated all activity dock. So this is really not saying, okay, ready to write that check. This is saying the program that makes sense for us is that the one that's that other option. Okay, the second one is a much more modest dock. Doesn't extend out as far, more in scope of kind of what's there already, but then providing, basically splitting the swimming activity kind of off and having that be something like a swim float. Swim floats are a very gray area. You'll see in the permitting summary in the code. And so that's another one of those things where if we went in immediately with a proposal and said, we're proposing this, it represents risk that we'll get comments back that, but the code wasn't envisioned to deal with public swimming floats because there was no public swimming in Lake Forest Park prior to this project. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so keep skipping along. Okay, some of the additional design items, people have mentioned these, utilities and stormwater. Corey and I did a walk around on our site project with the project manager who oversaw the construction of both Log Boom and Tualadees at Kenmore. And so one of the things that she shared with us is some of these surprises. So we had assumed, great, there's utilities to every one of these cabins. We're taking cabins down, we're adding some spigots to the bathroom, but hopefully we're like a net reduction, we can keep all these pipes. Her recommendation was assume that you're replacing everything. And then if you can keep something, then it surprises you with money back in the bank, but price it out as if everything is being redone. So you'll see that the utilities cost is, that's what the assumption is. Placemaking details, and then 2 example concepts that I'll share with you. And if those are not the concepts, they're just examples. And that's what your activity is for. It's for you guys to build the park example that feels right. You can also take these pics home if you want, but we would love to see what direction you're leaning in. So we'll photograph them at the end of this meeting, which is 16 minutes from now, unfortunately. Okay, so stormwater. This is obviously not a stormwater construction plan. This is a stormwater diagram with some initial thoughts so that we could get it priced. So the combined stormwater and utilities cost based on this thinking is between $1.2 and $1.4 million. Utilities, we're assuming Landscape lighting where it's necessary. We're assuming water, sewer, gas at each, or water, sewer, electric at each of the structures. Cabin 6 is grayed out because we 50-50 on cabin 6. To power that, pump up station, those types of things. A hydrant is likely, and then we may be required to put a water main on the dock. Not sure, that's a permitting question. Okay. Placemaking details, things like railing, fences, these are all priced into the individual areas. And so these are things like, path edging is captured in the beach area cost. Railing along that south side of the dock would be captured in the dock cost. And there's so many different ways that we can use the patterning and design of those to create the vision for the park. Looking at what's going to stay, the structure, the big trees, the spirit of the place, and then how can we bring some of that thinking out to, identify some of the other elements. So the, renovated railing on the relocated bridge and the viewing platform, how can that be related to the structure so that it feels like one continuous park? Okay, and then, so here's an example. If we put the plan together in this way, we're in that like 6.8 to 8.2. So this is more parking, the grand deck off the house, the biggest beach we can get, and the all activity dock, in the 6.8 to 8.2 at a concept level estimate. Example 2, with the minimum parking scenario, the modest deck, separate soft launch, and the smaller dock, so kind of the pared down, but keeping cabin 6. So not the lowest that we could go, because we've got cabin 6 in there. We're at a 5.8 to 7 million. So the guidance for show us designs that are between log boom and qualities, escalated up to $2026. This is where we are on the poster back there. We're right in between the two. When we look at our lowest possible and our highest possible. Highest possible, we're actually kind of slightly over qualities by $0.6 million based on these conservative costs at this point. But we're sort of in that sweet spot of where we were asked to be, but likely nudging up a little bit closer to quality spot. Okay, so here's some visuals of looking at, approaching the park. So walking down Beach Drive, we've got the chain link fence of the Civic Club on the right-hand side. Civic Club property ends at that end fence post. We've got an open view that unites both the front of the preserve with the front entrance. So now if you guys tell us that you don't want one of these options, we have to redo all these renderings. So that's why the renderings are taken to a sketchy point. We also, when we show the public really finished photorealistic things, they go, you guys made the decisions already. And they don't give us as much input. So, so this shows without cabin 6.
So that structure
That's
is the
with
house.
cabin 6. Yes. So you can see this is either parking option. They look the same. This has to be minimum parking because it retains cabin 6. So there's not a big difference visually because we have all that nice screening in the front of the property. That keeps more parking from looking like a parking lot. So this is basically, if you're walking down Beach Drive and looking at what will be the exit of the park, so you can see that the garage has been demoed halfway. We've got a much smaller structure. We've got this view of this nice, opening plaza. And so again, this retains cabin 6. This one removes cabin 6 and has a slightly wider parking area.
Sorry, can you do that one more time before I-
Sure. Okay, so here we've got the entrance to the preserve. So this would be, imagine if you walk into that, walking onto that sidewalk and you're kind of coming down this little preserve path and you're catching sight of that first little seating nook. Now in the plan, those are at, I think 15 by 15. So they're big enough for a picnic table because we thought, well, maybe we want picnic tables on these and then we can afford it because it's in the cost estimate. But obviously if it's just a bench, it might be 8 by 4. And so we can reduce cost that way. We can mix them up. We can have 2 for picnic tables near the, shelter, but then have the other ones be bench only. So again, opportunities for cost control. Okay, so here's the preserve entrance. This one has no cabin 6. So the structures that you'll see on your left are the renovated bathroom and then behind that the house has cabin 6. You can see in the back where roughly where that bridge would be located. And then you can see back here, this is sort of the representation of the simple structure. So you would have that vision of, walking down the sidewalk, once the preserve, once you're on this path, the preserve sort of opens up, you can see down the creek. Then coming around that path, that's where you would start to see the reveal of the deck behind the house. You would see the reveal of the shelter down in the distance. And of course, the view out to the water with each of these. So this is a neat one. So this is standing in that plaza with the modest deck. And this has the minimum parking area where it retains cabin 6. So straight ahead is the bathroom building. That looks like a garage door, but it was meant to be just a wall with like doors on either side. Sorry about that. So right-hand side, cabin 6, left-hand side is the house. And so then this changes to that grand deck, where basically the entry sequence encourages you to walk up and to catch that view. And then you can descend down into the center part of the park, rather than having a plaza where you can kind of get into the bathroom, the other structures are locked. And then you're,
That's the beginning of the ramp. So
yes. Mhm.
Did you say if there's a ramp, there is no cabin 6? Was there a?
No, so there's no correlation there. So
Okay.
either of the deck structures work with any of the parking area any of the parking area, any of the structure. So one thing about the program on the interior of the structure is that I think if based on the square footage area of the structure, if we packed it full of as many people as fire marshal would allow, we needed like 50 spaces, right? Was that what Jen's math was?
Yeah, but yes.
And so
Right.
we could basically say, fire marshal limits on this building, if we have the parking, 250 people. Or we could just say the capacity of this is 75 people, and then we have arguments for less parking,
We can just post occupancy.
right?
But yes, that's
Mhm.
correct. We can
Yeah.
also assume shared parking
Mhm.
across the street.
Right, so there's so Jeff's team would be the one making the argument for how many people are gonna park, that we have shared parking, that there's those sorts of things, the cooperative agreements that would need to be in place for the city hall parking and all of that stuff. And then, Jack's team would basically be saying, okay, so if you want minimum parking, that ties us to this capacity for the structure. And then you guys would say, well, we want to rent it out to groups bigger than that, then it puts us towards a more parking scenario. So that's also another thing to think
Well,
about.
people have to have a place to drop everything off if they're gonna be
Right.
using the building. We can't expect people are gonna take a wagon,
Yeah.
Right.
with their stuff.
And so the options that we
City
have for that
hall.
are the vehicle rated path that enters the plaza. We also have the parking bay on the side. We also have, sufficient width in that for basically a parallel up on the side. And even in the minimum parking scenario, we've shown it where we've got 5 spaces, but we might only need 3. So we might still have 3 ADA accessible spaces and then 2 other spaces that could be permit only. You rent the building, you get your parking permit, those types of things. So again, those are operational concerns and operational things that we can figure out, but the construction cost of that minimum parking area would be the same. Okay, so here's that visual again with the ramp.
And what's that building in the back there?
That is the old garage, half demolished and made into the park restroom.
So we would have restrooms there and in the big building?
Well, the big building would be locked. So if you're at the swimming area and you're not renting the building,
Oh, so it would
you
just
would
be
need
a
to have a
bathroom.
swimming bathroom, right?
Got it.
And would there also be, I'm trying to remember, is there also a path straight out? to
Yes.
the-
So, basically on your diagram, if you are,
Yeah, okay.
parking, look for the parking area and the deck area. And that's where those two things start to be, showing, the grand deck versus the modest deck. So that's whether the ramp greets you or doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah, so you got 2 parking area choices, 2 central area, Okay. So here's the central area. So this is basically, we're standing at what would be the end of the designated kayak launch and looking back at, you can see the play area in the center. This is a representation of the simple shelter. So separate soft launch, and then the deck is basically from this distance going to look very similar, in regardless of the thing. So this gives us slightly bigger beach because we don't have the designated soft launch, which is bigger beach and lawn. And then we've got really a representation of more like the chimney structure here and showing what that could look like. So again, thinking about what it would look like to look into the center of the park, recreating on the lawn and looking back, and what that spatial relationship would be like. Okay, so here's again, standing in essentially the same spot, but casting your gaze like down the beach, and looking at the dock. So this is the modest dock. And this is the all activity dock. Okay, and then here is sort of the whole waterfront together. So this one is showing the smaller dock with the swim float, and it's got the biggest beach in the configuration, so there is somebody launching a paddlecraft in that spot. And then here's this showing the separate launch and showing the all activity dock. So this would, what you would be seeing here is essentially that integrated swim platform. And the swimming area.
We should just call it the teenage
The hangout.
area.
I have one question about
Yes.
the depth of water. It is such.
Yeah,
a
that's what
long-
I was gonna.
Yes.
So long and shallow. Do we actually think it's feasible that anyone's gonna swim except off the end of the dock? And how far out would that platform?
So one thing that we heard in the feedback was wading.
Okay.
I wanted to be able to wade in the water. And so we know that the beach itself provides space for wading. We also know that the big swimming time is the summer, when on this lake, the water's high. And so we would expect that things could take place a little bit closer to the shore. But obviously, yes, this is an accreting beach. We did get bathymetry with the survey, which is, you know, that they actually go out and they take stations and they do the underground or the underwater contours all the way out past to the end of the dock. So now we have more information on what a realistic length of that dock could be. And so all of those things will go into, you know, maybe this integrated swim platform scoots down the dock by 10 feet. That might be something that we do. So we are proposing, for a cost perspective, a fixed dock. So because of how shallow this is, obviously, if it's floating, there will be times when it's just laying on the ground, which is not really any fun. So a fixed facility is more expensive. If we're out in deep enough water at the end of that dock, we may be able to propose that the end of the dock is floating, and that is much less expensive. So you would imagine a fixed pier out to a certain point, a gangway, and then a floating dock. But that would have to happen out in deeper water. And there's really specific regulations about floating dock design, according to our marine engineer, because of things getting potentially trapped underneath it. There has to be sufficient depth of water. You have to, the like incidence of stranding of the floating thing has to be, there's all sorts of math that they'll do to figure that out. But it is priced as fixed at this point. Okay, and then here's basically looking, this is either dock because they are both the same from this vantage looking back. And either beach, this would be the view that you would be seeing of sort of that one emerging overlook located near the mouth of the creek, but roughly where the existing dock is, or the, yeah, on that further. Okay. So we have 3 minutes left in our meeting time. I am so sorry. I'm glad that we had some discussion during, and are there questions that you guys have? I know this is a tremendous amount of information. So they're here now. And we're also around if you wanted to compile questions in a written format, we can provide feedback that way too.
Just so, to get a sense of, the length of the dock area, do you know how long the existing one in Kenmore is in Long Boom?
You know, I don't know the distance in Kenmore, and I don't know the lake environment necessarily at that specific place
Yeah.
at Log Boom. And so that is gonna be one of the big drivers for the deck construction. The dock construction is just like what the lake is doing and where we need to be in terms of the, you know, depth profile.
I was just, I'm trying to visualize how, you know, because there is a cost, component to it, the cost difference to versus 125 versus, vis-a-vis the 200, and trying to, visualize it in my head compared to, what is or is existing in Long Boom.
Well, so I
Because
think
that one is.
588.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
It's really long.
It is.
It's really long, yeah.
How do these compare to what's existing on the site now?
so the neighbor's dock is drawn to scale.
Okay.
And so you can really see the comparison and you can see the shadow.
Shadow.
Yeah, underneath the water
Uh-huh.
yeah, so you can see that we're basically twice as wide. And we are slightly longer, except with the modest one that's proposed, then we're at about the same length of dock. And wider than the current ones that are there.
And for context, 120 feet is the longest that's currently allowed. So when I talked about potential code changes to add more flexibility, it's 120 feet is the max.
Lion Creek right now has, what is that like,
160-ish,
160?
160. Yeah, and it looks like Civic Club is about 275.
So 125 is short.
So this is part of that kind of two-step approach to permitting, where some of the groundwork for, you know, how does Lake Forest Park regulate its public waterfront park properties, which is currently not handled. And so it may mean that there's some internal work that the city has to do. Of course, you know, Kenny would be there to guide and provide, you know, recommendations and feedback or whatever support is needed. But getting that going, that early coordination prior to us putting in an application and then sort of forcing the city staff to make those decisions without first given the chance to say, we have this new property, we have this new use in our city that we haven't really had before. And how would we handle it? Yes.
And I just wanted to point out that currently Line Creek is gated, it's fenced in. So it is open and closed by the police department. And this current design does not have any fencing. So it will be open access like bamboo.
So that is what is proposed in the current design. We do have costs for the split rail fencing, which is habitat fencing. So one of the things about mitigation areas is that if you have a mitigation area that you're saying, you know, I'm restoring this area to offset those impacts, you then can't open that area to those impacts. So you need to basically say, this is a delineation that says that's the area that we're impacting, this is the area that's being preserved in perpetuity for as long as that impact is maintained. And one of the conditions is that that fencing needs to allow the movement of wildlife across it, right? So I don't know if that means that we couldn't put up an entry fence across this whole thing. Should it be chain? Maybe not. Should it be a vehicle swing gate? Is that gonna keep anyone out? I mean, I know that there are people that trespass in the preserve because we've heard about it a lot in some of that community engagement, where yes, there's a fence, but sometimes people jump it, sometimes they come around, sometimes, you know, so it's one of those things where there's very little that we can do to promise that people won't get onto this property.
Yeah.
And so then you start kind of removing those layers, and posted rules and open and closed signs will keep most people out. But the people who would climb the fence they would anyway, you know? So again, that's an operational thing. And so we would have the ability with the finished project to add those devices later if the city and the community thought that they were necessary, or we can add them to the project cost.
Just to clarify about the budget, if I want all of the big things, that's the 8.7, that's like the most expensive.
So that is what we should ask for a construction cost, but remember, we also need to pay to design it. We need to pay for city staff time, there's things like sales tax, and so it would actually be 40% above the max cost. And that's what's on that yellow tax page. Yeah, these are our costs.
Right.
And those, again, are guesses and estimates. But we will get closer to that when we have the preferred design. And our team says, okay, if I'm designing this facility, how much will that be? And then we'll price it again with the same detailed pricing exercise.
And maybe this is a question for Councilmember Bodie, I'm not sure, but is the input from us, what do we want as citizens and parks enthusiasts? Or is what you all want from us sort of a budget-minded, like more pragmatic take?
Well, it's both. So, I mean, I think that if you said we would like to have it all the best options, all the larger options that add up to the higher costs, that would be fine. And if you then said, but if you need to economize, these are the things that we would be okay with. I think something like that that's layered would be good. Because that's what we as the council members will be grappling with ourselves. So if you can give us some sense of what you prefer, but then also what you would be willing to accept, or the least worst changes to what you prefer, that would be very helpful.
So I do want to mention that, you know, if cost management, so step one is that we heard everything that we could based on, you know, running through some facilitation to get to where we are here. So we've been able to present more information to you guys to sort of frame questions and give you something to speak to rather than speaking out in the ether, which is what we asked everybody to do in the first place. So if we hear, we love it, we want all the big things, but we need to be conscious of cost, then that starts to drive our decisions about where can we move the needle. Now, can we go to less expensive doorknobs and less expensive, facing on the ceiling? That's like tenths of degrees in cost. The big things are, reductions in square footage. Can we still provide an all activity dock? That's less money. Sure, we can make it shorter. We can reduce the square footage. That helps a lot. We can investigate seriously floating the end of it to drop cost more. So that's the way that we would want to work in that equation. If
we
you
make
say.
it 7 feet wide, we can't, going back and making it 10 feet wide later, it's gonna be,
Exactly.
yeah.
We basically, the preferred design will represent the schematic design. And so we'll price our fees based on that. We'll design from that as a starting point. If things come out, that's okay. If anything goes in at that point, then design. Right.
I think I was trying to say that in a much less articulate way.
But on the other side of that, if you say, we're gonna pick the least program, we want the smaller of everything in order to get the big numbers down. But we want it to be nice, because our community deserves nice things. Well, that gives us the ability to buy the finest doorknobs that we want, to everything that you put everything that you put your hands on in the park, everything that you get close to has that little extra degree of care. And those details, because we move the needle a big way, the railing on the boardwalk can become a little bit better. Those hidden details of, Easter eggs hidden through the landscape and the site work, those start to pop out. So instead of doing, a concrete stamp, maybe it's a bronze medallion that's, in the sidewalk.
And you
So-
mentioned public art,
Yes.
which I assume is not part of any of this pricing.
No, we priced basically based on the pictures that we saw, so kind of, the higher end of finishes towards the deck if we go in that direction. Because we wanted you to be able to make decisions like this and then not have like a switcheroo with the pricing later.
But yeah, if you wanted a statue, then that's just.
Right,
On top
that
of
that
the
would be
rest.
extra, but there are outside funding. So somebody mentioned an arts council at the first meeting and basically said that they have some money. So does that mean that it's ours? No. Does it mean that we can make a strong proposal to them and be welcoming of any funding that they want to support to doing that? That would be great, So.
And can I just say, for some of the small details and finishes, our board chair Tyler has been involved in some discussions with the city, like what could the community contribute? So there are some opportunities on some of those finer finishes or artwork for community donations and contributions too.
And so that is definitely something that we wanted to include as, like a acknowledgement of donations, acknowledgement of funding partner. So maybe it's, family names stamped in the sidewalk, or maybe it's, yeah, exactly, buy a brick, those types of programs.
It's fun. The
Yes.
brick, people love that.
Mhm.
They really do.
This could be a save a brick.
Exactly.
Save brick. And then
Yeah.
have your name stamped into it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I ask, are there any of these options that have different levels of maintenance costs or anything we should think of the
So-
longer term?
Yeah, I mean, more moving parts, more expensive to maintain. Obviously, the bigger dock, there's more surfacing that might need to be replaced. There's those types of notes, more lawn, more mowing. I mean, what's out there right now, it doesn't need to be mowed all that frequently because it's 50-50 lawn and other stuff. But yes, there are those types of
Do
things.
we have a budget yet? I mean, have we been given a number? No, we don't have a number.
No, I
Oh,
think we are.
I
we
understand.
are-
Oh, good. Everything.
We're starting from this point and building up, and I think then we're going to be seeking funding, and we'll see how that goes. But perhaps Corey, you have a better answer than I do.
So we, the cost feedback that we had been given early on was, well, probably more than long boom, probably less than qualities. In terms of, the type of, what are people around us doing? What does the market look like? And that's really where we are with the current proposal. Now, if we had been given different guidance, these concepts would look different. If it was, we have a $2 million budget.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
Like this.
Exactly. Versus we have a $25 million budget that's funded. There'd probably be some other stuff in there. So here's where we are, and it's based on the feedback that we received from you guys.
This may be much larger discussion, but for my day job, I'm with the legislature in its budget session. I'm doing a bunch of calls for that. They go close CNDA March 4th, I think.
Okay.
So is there anything that we know of in that short legislative session that that would be viable to ask for? That the legislature might be able to appropriate towards, I'm thinking of like especially the road crossings, things like that, that we should be talking about now, or that we should be planning for as lobbying down the road, separate from the RCO process.
I think that's a fantastic idea, and we did hear that from, I think it was Councilmember Bodie, but then also Councilmember Lebo at one of the prior presentations to council, which was to really start thinking about a funding strategy for this. RCO is one, I mean, it's one bucket of a bunch of different buckets, so that's kind of nice that we can put in an application and they can guide us on where, you know, we want to be in the running for. But there's lots of other programs outside of that, and, you know, legislative ask is a good one. That's a good thought about what do we know we want to ask for before March 1st or March 4th.
I think that's what
It is. Can I just say it is difficult to ask for just money for a broad purpose. So when we've been successful with state legislative funding requests, we have we've had something very specific with preliminary designs and community support. So I think this exercise will put us in that position for the next go round, but I think it would be hard for this session unless there's a grant fund that's coming up this session that we could take advantage of in the next few months.
Yeah, and
So,
I think like we would have to do a version of this presentation to our legislators like next week to probably get, for them to be able to put something into this
Right.
year's budget session. But we're not gonna be doing the work until
right.
after the next session would start and when they
So-
can actually be here for that.
Yeah,
conversation.
so it is 9:15, so I do want to let anybody know if you had a commitment to go at 9, definitely feel free. I can stick around a little bit longer for sure. As far as what we maybe could carve off, I think the easier things to carve off would be those pieces that have a direct benefit to, you know, resources to the community and that don't have options. And the one thing that sticks out to me is the preserve, is removing the 2 docks and then putting in the one that is off the preserve property. So saying, you know, the city has invested tremendously in the health of Lion Creek, in preservation and flooding and creek improvements, you know, all from back to the legacy plan that Lake Forest Park did 15 years ago, and moving ahead with some of these improvements to benefit quality of life and, you know, sensitive areas throughout the city. That is another step in that direction of sort of saying, we acquired this property, now we can finally retreat from this sensitive jewel that we have. And that, I think, would actually be something that we've got a lot of materials and that we could provide some feedback and some fodder for you guys to make a presentation. If you felt like that was the direction that you wanted to go in, but that might be a piece that has, I mean, Councilmember Bodie, what you were saying, that clear direction to it.
Yes, let me, I think, you know, we have our lobbyist already working on our behalf with the state legislature, but I'll circle around on that piece with the mayor and the city administrator and see if they have any thoughts on, you know, if there's spare money floating around, could we lay claim to it? But that's a really good rationale and a very good kind of discrete piece that you suggested. I just want to say thank you. It's been an awesome presentation. I thought it was so, I know you had to move quickly, but it's been so focused, and the options I think have been really valuable.
I wonder also for about the sidewalk as something that might be, like there probably is money for that sort of
Yes.
traffic work, and it's not purely park, it's, you know, state route, there's
Well,
other things involved.
That's also a very interesting piece because it's discrete, it's, you know, right away, it's kind of got a program moving ahead and, it serves the existing preserve as well and the civic club. So, you know, having a sidewalk and a crossing that extends down to their property as well. You know, there's a lot of people that walk to the civic club, as well. Mhm.
Thank you. I'll take those ideas back and we'll see. I'm not completely optimistic given the short time frames and where we are, but it's worth a try.
To be next round.
Sure, yeah, it's, like I say, I'm
Getting the
I've been
ideas out
spending
there.
time on it
Yeah.
for work, so the thought occurred to me for this. And for PTA stuff too.
Okay, so the meeting intent was to educate you guys, present all of this information, give you the opportunity to ask questions, despite giving you like so much information that it might be hard to think about questions yet. The second piece was we need to be preparing to present the information to the public on the 21st. And so not necessarily right now, but in your deliberations as a board, if there are options that you feel like are not right, that we missed the bar slightly, you know, or entirely, and we need to throw that puzzle piece away, we can do that. And then that last piece would be making sure that you guys have the information that you need to approach a preferred recommendation that you'll be providing to council, hopefully before they're not meeting on the 14th.
They're not.
For the meeting on the 21st, the public meeting, is your plan to present these puzzle pieces? To that?
Yeah, so our plan for the public, and this is granted, you know, we're still workshopping what the exercises will be. We haven't got the feedback from you guys, but if you said this is a go, present everything. Yes, we would basically have a series of exhibits that would educate people about the design options. We would have puzzle piece exercises, and then we will have some way of selecting the options that aggregates the results. So that may be voting that goes into a bin. So we often use, you know, clear jars so that people can see how many people have voted for each choice. And so they're kind of seeing the trend in the room. There's also, you know, virtual voting platforms where you can kind of see the live graphic move on the screen as people are taking the phone survey. It does require you to have a phone. There's some barrier to entry there. And so we want to make sure that whatever we're providing, for one, collects the data for us so we can provide a really sound, the community voice agreed on these things. Recommendation to you guys and to the council. And then the other bit is that it shouldn't be too onerous in terms of, you know, administering the meeting itself. But that's the direction we're going.
I'm worried about.
Could I just add, we can schedule a special council meeting if needed in that early March timeframe because we can't meet the 14th or that week. So there's some opportunities there, but I'll also circle around with my colleagues on that.
Thank you. We wanted to be conscious of the 3-touch requirement and provide, you know, at least 4 touches.
We absolutely will need that because we're trying to be more meticulous about the 3-touch rule. So so thank you very much, and we'll try. Corey will follow up on that too, and we'll try to find a time to replace the 14th.
Okay, and then we were targeting the working session to be able to give the opportunity to council members that the Parks and Rec Board has today. So whether it's a February meeting that we need to look at or something like that, we can coordinate on schedule.
We'll have to,
Yeah.
we might have to schedule another meeting. That's what I'm thinking. If they want our input for the public meeting, we need to have another meeting with the
Maybe
board.
after the open house. before
Right,
voting.
go back to that slide.
Oh, I thought they wanted information from us prior to the public, isn't that what you
So
said?
it's mainly if there's something about the presentation that you're saying, we know our community, don't show them this.
Or make sure you put this thing back. in.
Yes,
Yeah, I just
exactly.
think we need to.
So, right, so, oh, there we go. Okay, so.
Yeah.
Corey, you're providing the update to council on the 8th. I don't know if that counts as one of those 3 touches. And then, yes, the community workshop is scheduled for the 21st and your scheduled meeting is the 27th.
We try to do like maybe just a Zoom call next week or, well, while this is relatively fresh in our minds, would that?
Yeah, I think that's a great.
Yeah, we can schedule.
I can't do it Monday, but other than that. Not available.
Okay, I'll send out.
Why don't you send out
thing.
something?
We'll
that
meet
we can
that
figure it
first or
out.
second weekend of February before the open.
Yeah.
To kind of get our thoughts on this.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing you need that input pretty soon. To
It's
get that
easier to
lined
take
up.
something out than to
Okay.
add something. The sooner the
Right,
better
I don't
is
think there's
great.
gonna be any additions.
But we purposefully planned out this schedule to allow, some weeks of time. Obviously, we've been, swimming in this information for a couple weeks, trying to figure out how to tell the story. And now you guys just got all of it at once, so.
Yeah, I think that will work well. Actually.
I think it's a good idea, the sooner rather than before it goes away, it's
That's all
fresh
I have.
now, I'm like,
Still have
I
like-
don't want it to be
Yeah, we
too
still-
much time.
we also have like an extra week. We still have a month basically.
I know, but I think what we're saying is it's very fresh tonight and I don't think we wanna wait too long to meet, to brainstorm what we heard tonight, because a lot of it'll go out of our heads, so I'm thinking sometime, whatever you said, I think you said next week, right?
I don't know if that works for people's
Yeah.
schedules, but if it's.
I'll send out,
Would you, Cory,
Yeah.
that'd be great.
Fantastic.
So sorry, I've got a dash, but thank you. This has been very helpful and good luck, Parks Board.
Thanks.
Good.
One thing, which, first of all, this was an incredible presentation, and thank you so much, it's so inspiring. It's exciting work. The second is, I'm worried about the February 21st date, because it is the midwinter break for Shoreline Public Schools. So any family with young children, that's a week that will go out of town. So it's already a demographic that often doesn't show up to things in the evening, is probably even less likely to. So I'm wondering if there is a way to make this available in another modality rather than just attending in person, so that we can reach.
So for the first workshop, basically we, administered the workshop and then put all of the content online with a survey that asked you to do the same things. Where would you put the dots? Where, right, but it was after, so it was, we had one data in person and then all of that was put on the website and we had the survey going for the, to cap, so anyone could participate in the website after the fact. If it's critical, based on the timing of the school district break and people being out of town and us expecting already fewer people being in person, we can start to structure that now, make sure that they're up around the same time. So the website and the in-person are happening around the same time, and we can change the promotion of the workshop to say, please come in person. You could also participate in this virtually. However, that may decrease participation at the workshop, which means that you don't end up with neighbors talking about it together. You end up with people doing it on their own, which not a bad thing, but the community conversation and the voices and, like watching people at the big game board at the first meeting, having those discussions about what they're placing and, those things, those are really important to this process.
I was gonna ask if there was a way to do a version of this, like to bring to a PTA meeting.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah,
mean,
that
if
fact.
it's okay to share this stuff with the community, you can take these and do that. So you now have, just like we gave you the engagement toolkit, first off, this is your engagement toolkit for the concept alternatives part of this stage. So we're officially out of free design, we're in concept alternates. You guys, as the ambassadors to the community, have kind of 4 weeks to be having this conversation. Yeah. But we would want to make sure that the information that's presented to the public in small group is the same as presented to the large group. And so that would be, if there's feedback, if there's puzzle pieces that we throw away, if there's little changes and tweaks that we make, that we do those now. Not now, but right.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Yeah. Maybe kind of, Corey, do we need to do the public comments? at the very end?
There's no public.
Okay, great. I'll maybe do a quick wrap up, which is, I agree with you, well, maybe all the comments. This has been a lot, all excellent. So, that's fine. I gave 2 thumbs up. I've been really impressed. It's been an interesting process the whole time, I think, to just hear all the different ideas that are kind of swirling around with all the different pieces and to see it actually come together into maybe not one single plan, but like representations of all the options. I think it's been really informative, like you said, inspiring, some next year work. I think we have a lot to think about, and speak for myself, at least, putting it all together. If we have questions, shall we coordinate those through you, Corey? We can get those in the team.
Yeah, and I think in the interest of the design team's time and getting you guys answers that are sort of, you know, it's all public record stuff. And so if you guys can, in your meeting, kind of come up with key questions, or whenever you do it, organize those and then send it over to us. We'll circulate to the team, have all of the disciplines weigh in on the respective issues, and then provide you guys back with a summary of that. That way it's not in 5 different emails, kind of in threads and stuff like that. Yeah.
The question is basically, is there anything here that should not be presented to the public? That's just.
That's a critical question for meeting that next node in time. Yes. Mhm.
And at some point, we should also, it can be based on public feedback, but it can also just be as this group, what do we like? What would our priorities be?
And also that's what the city council will.
Yeah.
Right. So that's their.
But what do we recommend?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
All right.
You're not available. Okay.
Not Monday.
All right, as we work on that schedule, and take that off.
Please don't go Monday.
With that, I will, since there's no public comment, right? Okay, we can skip that part of the meeting. I'll adjourn our January meeting. We'll formally meet again in February, maybe sooner.
Can I take a picture of your puzzles? If they represent